Hi, welcome to Module 2. We are talking about the headline, and as you can see by this contents, we are talking about a few variations of the headline in this part 1 of the headline video. So I will start bringing you some pictures to help explain. So the first one, picture here, the headline usually goes about 3/4 of the way across the palm and sits underneath the top line. So the headline is medically called the lower transverse crease, and the heart line above it here is called the upper transverse crease. Now I always check the headline in a palm reading because from there you can see how the person thinks. You can see if they have a clear mind, are they logical? Do they have empathy? Do they have any history of trauma that might have affected them mentally? And from the headline we can see if they are carefree and adventurous or whether they're more insecure. Also how well they can concentrate and whether they're impulsive or whether they overthink or whether they're quick thinkers and just get to the point kind of thing. So we're going to talk about all of those to do with the headline. Next picture. First thing we're going to talk about is if it's separated from the lifeline. So on the above picture, the straight red line is away from the black lifeline. Widely separated, it shows someone a bit more ambitious and they love life and they're a bit more impulsive. The narrower the gap, the less confidence, but they can think for themselves, so they are confident enough to make their own decisions. So in a headline with the wide gap, they're not necessarily connected by a bond to the family. So if you imagine the lifeline as the start of the family and the mind is not connected, so that's like a disconnection, which makes that person more independent. So they've learned to think for themselves at a young age, either by choice or by circumstance, and the wider that is, the more impulsive or foolhardy, especially if the fingers are set wide apart. I haven't got this diagram set very nice, but if all these gaps between the fingers are wide, that gives a more freedom-loving individual, and the wide gap between the headline and the lifeline confirms that they like to be independent and think for themselves. And if you look at the above picture, where the ring finger is joined to the index finger, they literally look like there's no gap there. You can see a gap between the pinky and the ring finger. That's quite normal, and so is having literally no gap between those middle finger and ring finger. And that just indicates a more security conscious person, someone who does like to obey the rules and follow guidelines, and they make quite good employees. Now, moving on, it's a little bit more common to have the headline joined to the lifeline. These types of people are likely to take their time becoming independent. The longer the join is from the edge of the palm, possibly the more insecure their ways are. They may have a deeper bond with the family and maybe cling to that security of the parents' home base or their lifestyle. The attitude in general is inhibited or reserved with a reluctance to make decisions on their own This is especially true at the early stages of life. Like once the lifeline separates from the headline, that shows the approximate age of independence. Like I have here, the shape of the hand and the fingers should be considered. A sensitive water hand might enhance the qualities of insecurity, whereas active fire hand brings a bit more balance. So if you understand the fire hand is a more solid palm with shorter fingers, and the water hand has a more long, narrow palm with longer fingers. The long headline is one that goes beyond a certain point. Now, how you can judge that is if you draw an imaginary line between the pinky and the ring finger to the center of the base of the palm. If the headline fails to reach beyond that line, it's short. If it goes beyond that point, that's classed as a long headline. Even if it goes slightly beyond it, it's probably more an average length. But if it goes well beyond that point, it's classed as a long headline. And these types of people have a little bit more of a broader range of analytical interest. A person who seems to have more intelligence, however, that's not really true, but the theory may have come about because of the attention to detail and the no-nonsense kind of approach to life. The meaning does vary if it's sloping downwards or if it goes straight across. So the one that's very long and straight across shows a bit more of a sophisticated researching type of a thinker. They tend to consider a bit more evidence before making decisions and are more philosophical than those with a short headline. If it runs entirely across the palm all the way to the edge, that's called a Sydney line. That gives a bit more obsessive qualities. So we can talk about that later when I talk about the SIMIAN lines. But John E. Fincham describes this type of Sydney line as someone who's cut off from their inner feelings, may have a bit of a hard edge over their personality. And Albert Einstein had a very extended headline that wasn't connected to the lifeline, and so we talked about that before, where it shows the independence. And Albert Einstein, according to researchers, had Asperger's syndrome, which is a high-functioning type of autism. It's characterized by eccentric behavior rather than an impairment, so it didn't impair him. So mostly people with Asperger's are labelled as eccentrics. They can lack social skills. They can be fascinated with complex subjects and have communication difficulties, especially in children. So while they're young, they may struggle communicating with other people. However, the long headline on its own obviously is not a sign of Asperger's. People with long and profoundly sloping headline that comes down to this Mount of Moon area, they should all try to channel their imagination into creative or spiritual pursuits because it's reaching down to the moon, which is a very creative and nurturing area. So these people might have feelings of depression or a vague sense of reality if they don't have an outlet for this energy. So to round it off, the long headline signifies someone with a wide range of interest. They may be fond of research, study. They can absorb a lot of information. They may have many hobbies, and they may see the future outcome or long-term results in a project. They may be cut off from their feelings, especially if there is connecting lines from the heart line to the headline. And they may actually overthink everything, so taking things too far in their thinking. Let's move on to the next slide. Now, here's a good example of a short headline. It starts off quite thick and then it thins out, and that's where it stops. Perfect example of a short headline. As we mentioned before, if you draw that imaginary line from between the pinky and the ring finger down to the center of the palm, clearly does not reach that marker. So the short headline is a little bit more significant if it's on both hands. The average length that reaches here has a little bit less significance. So it might actually surprise you that the headline, even though we talk about the headline being about the intellect and the practical, logical, the mental side, about your head, what your mind is thinking, but it also represents the emotions. So when it is short, especially, it shows that lack of empathy. So let me explain that. As we talked about the long headline before, if it reaches anywhere towards the Mount of Moon area, that gives more empathy. The headline carries information from an actual world aspect of the moon. This is the subconscious area. This is where our core identity connections respond to emotional values. And these can become reflected in a person's responses mentally. When it is not reaching there, the short headline shows that the thinking is practical and analytical with less emotion, less empathy. In some circumstances, this kind of a short headline has its advantages. Can you imagine a surgeon who needs to amputate a limb, or an ambulance officer who sees a person injured in an accident? Like, especially if it's a child, these kind of jobs require a disconnection from emotional responses. If there's no other developmental conflicts, the interpretation in the personality may show some neurotic behaviors, but it doesn't represent any mental health issues. In general, it shows someone with more concern over practical and routine matters, preferring to concentrate on what's going on now. The long headline were like to fuss over details, so the short headline person is not going to be interested in fussing over details. They want to get to what they're doing. They don't want to waste time. They want to quickly apply what they know to achieve their goals. It can come with other problematic interpretations, the short headline. If you consider any genetic factors or developments in the personality, there are too many possible learned behaviors to mention, but severe mental issues may take over the personality if it's seen in combination, like with a weak headline. If you watch the video with Ted Bundy on my Lifeline video lesson 4, so that's part 3 of the Lifeline lesson. I had an example of Ted Bundy and his very weak headline. We'll talk about that weak headline some more shortly. But yeah, when it's in combination with a weak headline, if it's broken, if they're fuzzy lines, if there are fuzzy lines everywhere, if the headline is fuzzy, if the heart line is fuzzy, chained lines, things like that. So these can be signs of mental issues, mental disabilities as such. But the short headline by itself does not. And I'll bring up another slide for the weak headline now. Here's a good example of a weak headline. You can see that in this picture that it's broken and it's thin. It's not very deeply etched. So sometimes these weak headlines are also chained in their appearance. The faint line demonstrates mental delicacy. So you can imagine if it was etched a bit more deeper, there is more strength to the line. Because it's so faint, thin, it may show someone more nervous, more shy, quiet, someone a bit of a daydreamer, or they may have difficulties with logical decisions or concentration. If the heart line has flaws, like it's chained, that may denote emotional struggles because the mental side, the head, is not able to support the heart line. So you need balance. When the heart line is strong and it doesn't have that balancing, can denote those emotional struggles. There may also be some lack of common sense or somebody who suffers periods of mental pressure. With this strong heart line, there might be passion or obsession with something as well, because the heart line is ruling over the headline. Now I've got another picture here. I don't know how I bring it up. Do I have to click? There it is. Another example that I've got a drawing here of the Ira Marlat. He was a so-called prison demon. He served a life sentence for murder in the year 1890, a long time ago. He had a very poorly formed headline and a heart line. So his heart line had branches that were reaching towards the headline, almost like a SIMIAN line variation, which we'll talk more about in other videos. But his noticeable branches, short branches, that they come and cross the lifeline. So that's showing that there's a lot of stress related issues mentally. And so because it's also so short and not very deeply etched, that also gives that mind that he had. So he had also this noticeable ring of Saturn that appears like a ring of Saturn. It's like a girdle of Venus, ring of Saturn, and that's kind of proof of his bad temper and his capricious kind of nature. So there's obviously other features on his palms that showed his mental state. So he had bulbous fingertips, which are not drawn here. So as with all the lines on the palm, we do need to always compare the other lines and to see where the energy is coming from. Is the energy more mental? Is it more emotional and passionate? Or is there a nice fine balance? So later on in these video lessons, we'll probably come across some more examples of the weak headline, and I will discuss those in videos to come.